we build everything here from Superbirds, original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here just modifies new cars.
A ton of power.
A man who won 200 professional races has spent the last several decades of his life refusing to sell what most collectors would call the greatest untouched trove in American motorsport history. Multi-million-dollar offers have arrived at his door in Level Cross, North Carolina, more than once. He has turned down every single one. Somewhere behind a modest garage in that small town sits a stack of race cars nobody outside the family has been allowed to properly document, alongside objects that have never been photographed for public release. This is not a rumor built on speculation. It is a story Richard Petty himself has confirmed in pieces over the course of many interviews without ever fully opening the door. What is inside that space, and why a man who built his entire identity in front of television cameras has spent 60 years keeping part of his life completely private, says more about him than any trophy case ever could. To understand why any of this matters, you first have to understand what Richard Petty actually did on a racetrack, because without that context, old cars stacked behind a garage are just old cars. Petty competed in NASCAR's Top Series from 1958 to 1992, and in that span he won 200 races, a number so far ahead of the rest of history that it has essentially stopped functioning as a record anyone expects to break. David Pearson, the closest competitor across NASCAR's full history, finished with 105 wins, roughly half of what Petty achieved. Petty won 7 championships. He won the Daytona 507 times. He claimed 123 pole positions and started 513 consecutive races between 1971 and 1989, a streak of reliability and endurance that modern drivers, racing far safer and far more mechanically consistent cars, still have not approached. Across 35 years he made 1,184 career starts. Those figures are not simply impressive. They describe a level of dominance the sport has never seen matched by anyone before or since, which is precisely why fans nicknamed him the King and precisely why anything connected to his career carries weight far beyond ordinary memorabilia. None of that success happened in isolation. Petty Enterprises, the family operation his father Lee founded in Level Cross in 1949, became the most decorated team in NASCAR history, and it stayed a family business through every era of the sport's growth. Lee Petty won 3 championships of his own before handing the reins to his son. Richard's brother, Maurice Petty, built and tuned the engines that powered most of those 200 victories, engines assembled by hand in the same building that still stands today. Their cousin, Dale Earnhardt, served as Richard's crew chief for the majority of his career, coordinating pit strategy and mechanical decisions across 2 decades of championship runs. All 4 men, Lee, Richard, Maurice, and Dale Earnhardt, were eventually inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, an achievement no other family in the sport has come close to matching. That compound in Level Cross is where all of it happened, and it is still standing, largely unchanged, in a small town most people would drive through without a second glance. Richard Petty has said plainly, in interviews given over the years, that he never thought much about preserving old race cars while he was actively competing. In the 1960s and 1970s, a used race car was simply a used race car, and teams needed the money from selling it to fund whatever came next. Cars were sold off to smaller outfits on the West Coast, stripped down for spare parts, or left behind entirely once they had outlived their usefulness. Petty has openly admitted that nobody at the time imagined a battered stock car could someday be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to a collector, so nobody bothered trying to save them. The vehicles that survived were not saved because of foresight about their future value. They survived because circumstances kept them from being sold, and over the decades they ended up stacked behind the garage in Level Cross, exposed to North Carolina weather, layered on top of each other in a pile that Petty himself has estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 cars. What makes that pile significant is not simply the quantity. It is what those cars represent about the difference between preservation for profit and preservation out of loyalty. A car kept because of its resale value is, at its core, a financial instrument. A car kept because of a specific afternoon, a specific finish line, a specific memory tied to the people who built and drove it, is something else entirely, something the money was never really attached to in the first place. 2 vehicles inside that garage illustrate this divide better than any museum placard could. The first is a 1970 Plymouth Superbird, a car engineered specifically to exploit NASCAR's rules around aerodynamics, with a pointed nose cone and an oversized rear wing designed by Chrysler's racing engineers to cut drag and increase downforce at speeds nearing 200 miles per hour. Petty won 18 races driving Plymouth products during the 1970 season, and the Superbird became permanently linked with his iconic number 43 in a way few other cars in his career ever matched. The example sitting in level cross has never been restored or cleaned up for display. It carries the marks of decades-old racing contact, exactly as it was when it last competed. The second car tells the opposite half of the story. It is a 1957 Oldsmobile, built by hand in that same family garage by Lee Petty and his sons, and it is the car in which Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut as a 20-year-old with no idea what his career would eventually become. It is rough, aged, and far from glamorous. Where the Superbird represents the summit of what Petty achieved, the Oldsmobile represents the moment before any of it existed, when a young man from a small town first pointed a car toward a racetrack and discovered what he was capable of. Both cars sit in the same building today. Neither one has ever been offered for sale, and by every account from people close to the family, neither one ever will be. Former employees of Petty Enterprises have described, in scattered interviews over the years, a smaller room toward the back of the main garage, separate from the cars and tools, one that has never appeared on any official tour and is never mentioned in the museum's printed materials. Those who have described it tend to characterize it the same way, as a space where the more personal pieces of Petty's history were quietly set apart from everything meant for public view. According to those second-hand accounts, it reportedly holds boxes of decades-old fan letters, many never opened, kept not because Petty intended to respond to each one but because throwing them away never felt like an option to him. It reportedly also contains items connected to Dale Earnhardt Sr., who died at Daytona International Speedway on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500. Petty and Earnhardt were fierce rivals for 2 decades, two men with almost opposite driving styles and personalities who nonetheless built a mutual respect that ran deeper than most rivalries in professional sports ever do. Those who claim to have seen what Petty kept from that friendship describe the objects less as souvenirs and more as the kind of things a person holds onto after losing someone they understood better than most people around them ever did. There are also accounts, again unverified by any official source but repeated consistently by those close to the family, of the frame from the car Petty crashed at Pocono Raceway in 1980, a wreck in which his car went airborne and rolled violently before coming to rest. Petty walked away from that crash. If the frame is indeed still there, it has reportedly never been cleaned up or repaired, kept in the condition it was pulled from the wreckage in. Petty has never explained in detail, at least not publicly, exactly why he would hold onto something like that. But it fits a pattern that runs through everything connected to that garage, an instinct to keep the things that mattered rather than the things that were valuable, even when those two categories rarely overlap for anyone else in his position. The financial value of everything inside that space is genuinely difficult to estimate, precisely because so little of it has ever been formally appraised or offered for sale. Collectors and institutions have approached Petty over the years with serious interest, some hoping to acquire pieces outright, others proposing rotating exhibitions that would keep items under Petty family ownership while giving the public limited access. None of those conversations have gone anywhere. What makes his refusals more striking is the financial reality Petty Enterprises faced in its later years. As NASCAR became increasingly corporate and increasingly expensive to compete in during the late 1990s and early 2000s, the family team struggled, eventually restructuring and rebranding in 2008 as Petty's Garage, a shift away from competitive racing and toward custom vehicle building and restoration work. During those difficult years, the contents of that private garage represented a financial cushion Petty never touched, even as offers reportedly increased specifically because the timing made a sale seem more plausible to outsiders. He turned those down too. The Petty Museum, established by Richard's late wife Linda in 1988 and eventually relocated back to the Level Cross compound in 2014 after operating for years in nearby Randleman, remains the public-facing side of the family's story. Visitors can see championship-winning cars, trophies, uniforms, and racing equipment displayed with real care and organization, and it remains a genuinely worthwhile stop for anyone interested in NASCAR history. But it is not the same as the private garage, and Petty has never pretended otherwise. The museum holds what he chose to share. The garage holds what he did not, and that distinction is where the real emotional center of this story sits. Richard Petty's son, Kyle Petty, raced professionally for nearly 3 decades, winning 8 Cup Series races of his own, a respectable career by almost any measure that was nonetheless constantly weighed against his father's 200. Kyle has spoken candidly over the years about what it meant to grow up under that kind of shadow, and about how the garage in Level Cross represented something entirely different to him than it did to fans and collectors hoping for access. To outsiders it was history. To Kyle it was simply home, filled with the same tools he had watched his father and his uncle Maurice use since he was a child. Everything connected to that space changed emotionally after May of 2000, when Kyle's son and Richard's grandson, Adam Petty, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway after his throttle stuck and his car struck the outside wall. Adam was 19 years old and already racing professionally, representing a fourth generation of Pettys in NASCAR, a milestone almost no American family in any sport has reached. Kyle Petty has said publicly that losing Adam reshaped how he understood the value of everything the family had built. Richard Petty has spoken about it rarely, and always with the careful restraint of someone choosing each word because none of them feel adequate. After that loss, any remaining interest in opening that garage to commercial ventures or public tours effectively disappeared. The space became, more than ever, something reserved strictly for the family who understood exactly what it held. Richard Petty turned 86 years old in 2024, and by every consistent account from people who have met him in recent years, he still shows up at the Level Cross compound, still wears the cowboy hat and dark sunglasses that became part of his public image across 4 decades, and still takes time for fans who make the trip to North Carolina to meet him. Petty's garage continues operating as a custom restoration shop, and in recent years Maurice Petty and Dale Earnhardt, both now in their 80s, worked alongside the team to recreate the 1964 Plymouth Belvedere Championship car using original specifications and their own direct memory of how it was built, 3 Hall of Famers working from memory in the same building where the original had been assembled 60 years earlier. What that garage in Level Cross ultimately represents goes beyond dollar figures or rare automobiles. Most of what gets called legacy in professional sports is designed to be public, built for Hall of Fame displays and highlight reels consumed by people who were never actually there. Richard Petty built the single most statistically dominant career in the history of American stock car racing, and then he went home to a small town and quietly kept the things that mattered most to him behind a closed door, not to inflate their mystery or protect their resale value, but because some of what it cost him to become who he became was never meant to be sold in the first place. He understood that distinction clearly enough to act on it for the better part of 60 years, and in an era where almost everything eventually gets moneized, that kind of restraint may be the rarest thing sitting in that garage at all.